So good afternoon, everyone. How are you doing out there? Let's try that again. How's everybody? All right, that's better. We want to get this group warmed up. I hope that you are in the right session, but I'm sure you are, and that is mental health, a vulnerability, debating the role of bullying, loneliness, and mental health in male supremacist radicalization and counter-radicalization. That is the session that we are privileged to have a panelist on today. Jacob Ware will be our moderator for today. If you have a question, we're going to ask that you try the QR code in about 5 or 10 minutes. And if that does not work, Jacob has agreed that we'll take the questions from the floor, but hopefully by the time we need it to work, it shall be working. So we're just going to declare that that is the case, indeed. So, Jacob, you want to begin?
Yes. Am I on? Good. Thank you, Kathy, and thank you everyone for joining us. This is panel 6.4, Mental Health as a Vulnerability, debating the role of bullying, loneliness, mental health in male supremacist radicalization and counter-radicalization. Good to see some familiar faces out there that were here yesterday. So this is a continuation from the conversation we've been having. We have a tremendous panel today building on our previous presentations. I'll quickly introduce them in a second. Before we start, let me issue a very quick call to arms. Those of you who have been in the general sessions here know that Laura is very keen on deliverables. Real tangible policy ideas for us to take away, work on, and come back next year. So some of our panelists are going to bring up some ideas, talk about things. I want you all to be thinking as well about what we're missing. What are the pressure points that we haven't tried? Countering hate is going to require all of us, so when we bring something up, challenge it. Think of something better, and that way we can move the needle forward together. So I'll quickly introduce the panelists in the order they're going to speak. Ron Schouten is a clinical and forensic psychiatrist with specific expertise in the fields of targeted violence and behavioral threat assessment and management. He currently serves as the director of the Forensic Psychiatry Fellowship at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C. David O'Brien is director of infant, child, and youth mental health at Yorktown Family Services. He has over 25 years of experience working in the fields of child, youth, and young adult mental health within various frontline and managerial roles. Gillian Hunchak is a research analyst in public safety at the Canada Centre for Community Engagement and Prevention of Violence. Gillian has previously worked with leading P and CVE think tanks to undertake specialized research in digital mis, dis, and malinformation campaigns, incel communities, and far-right extremist groups across the UK, Canada, and the US. And finally, Pardeep Kalika is a hate and violence prevention senior advisor with the Working Group, co-director of Not in Our Town, and a de-radicalization trauma-focused clinical therapist with Parents for Peace. So I've invited each of the panelists to give a few minutes of remarks before we'll have moderator and audience Q&A, hopefully. And panelists, just to be clear, if there's anything else you'd like to mention as part of your introduction that would help us kind of contextualize your thoughts, feel free to do so. Ron, over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So I'm going to start by taking issue with the overly long title of our session here, because it starts out and it triggers one of my pet peeves, which is in that it talks about mental health as a vulnerability. Mental health is not a vulnerability. Mental health is what we all desire. Mental health is what we strive for. But this marks how the language has been sort of tormented over the years. No one wants to talk about mental illness. No one wants to talk about mental disease. It's been euphemized. So we talk about, oh, mental health is the problem. No, mental health is not the problem. Mental illness is a problem. Psychological distress is a problem. Trauma is a problem. Abuse is a problem. Neglect is a problem. And those are all factors that play in with incels. So starting out with definitions, and we've made some progress in this area. Now part of it is that those of us who treat patients, I started out in this work, in targeted violence work, working on workplace violence. And back then we had to deal, back in the 80s and early 90s, deal with all these profiles like, oh, people with mental illness are going to be violent. So we had to fight that stigma. We had to push back against all these notions that people with any mental illness are intended to be, are likely to be violent. So we finally made some progress on that, and we've made some progress on the terrorism literature as well, getting people to differentiate between mental illness, which to me is a diagnosable mental disorder, meets clinical criteria, cause social and occupational dysfunction, causes the person distress, right? And psychological problems. So there's a very nice article that just published by Sarma, Carthy, and Cox, and it's a review article, it's 65 pages long, a review of the literature, looking at the issue of mental illness and terrorist behavior, not radicalization, but actual terrorist behavior. And what they found is that the hypothesis that mental illness as a predisposing factor, as a causal factor in violent extremism, in acts of terrorism, doesn't hold up, right? And if anybody's interested in that paper, I have a copy here, and I can show you the citation, and you can look that up. But it's very nicely done. What I liked about the paper so much is that it draws a distinction between mental disorder in these studies, because it's always very difficult in all these studies, as we'll talk about, especially with incels, like diagnosed mental disorder, suspected mental disorder, which is often the best we can get from media presentations, and psychological problems. Psychological problems. So we go on that continuum. About 20% of us in any given year will have a psychiatric diagnosis, will have a mental disorder, diagnosable mental disorder, right? Psychological problems, pretty much all of us, right? At some point in our lives are going to have some sort of distress that we're going to be struggling, whether it's relationships or work or the world, right? The world currently as a point of distress. So there's a lot of mental health distress. And so I think as we talk about this and sort of framing this issue from a mental health standpoint, we need to use their language and talk about mental health difficulties. Because then the answer is, do mental health difficulties play a role in inceldom? It is a mental health difficulty. It's a political movement. It's all sorts of things. And there is psychological distress at the heart of it because it's all about perceived sense of, or an actual sense of isolation. But I'll leave that to others. Okay, so what is the most likely diagnosis in inceldom? What we hear about is autism spectrum disorder, right? Neurodevelopmental disorder marked by difficulty in communication and social interaction. One of the things that looms large is the notion of theory of mind, that people with autism spectrum disorder at various levels lack the capacity to understand the mental position of others. So it's what we call cognitive empathy, a lack of cognitive empathy. They have affective or emotional empathy, sometimes too much. So they can feel emotional pain in other people, but they can't name it. They can't see it on our faces. They can't relate to it. Right? So autism spectrum disorder, relatively new term because it is a spectrum disorder. The thing we most used to hear about is sort of a differentiation between high-level autism, Asperger's disorder, which is a diagnosis that's now, unfortunately, I think, gone by the wayside officially, and then people with real profound developmental defects with early in autism spectrum disorder, kids who can't control, kids who can't stand being touched, who have meltdowns and a lot of distress. So when we're talking about the people in the incel world who engage in acts of violence, and I'll turn to the percentages on that in a second, we're talking about people with relatively high-functioning autism spectrum disorder because they can engage in the community and interact with folks. So numbers of studies on this, self-report studies on incels, and they vary. I mean, 25 to 40% self-report autism spectrum disorder symptoms, which is many times over, like 40 times more than, well, about 10% of kids now, right? Their diagnoses have gone up quite a bit, but that's a phenomenal number, right? A percentage, like 40%, if the self-report accurate. 68% report depression. And we're not talking about somebody, necessarily people who meet the diagnosis of major depressive disorder, but we're talking about people who are sad, they are lonely, they are isolated, right? And they feel hopeless because they feel, many of them, that their incel status is permanent. They will never emerge from this, and they despair of that. So they may not have what I call big D depression, clinical depression, but depression, small d depression, is quite persistent in this population. What about the vulnerability of incels? Autism spectrum disorder is not particularly associated, with acts of violence. It's with comorbidity that it becomes related to acts of violence, and so it's really very damaging to the people in the ASD community. People who are living with autism and functioning very high, functioning very well, to be tarred with this. It's another form of stereotyping and stigmatization. There have been cases. One study looked at 7 incel-related cases of violence, and over half of them had some characteristics of autism spectrum disorder. So there's some speculation about, for a small portion of that population, they may engage in extreme acts of violence, right? But it's a very tiny percentage, especially when you look at the number of mass shootings and acts of mass violence. Another interesting issue, I think, is autism spectrum disorder as a risk for being recruited into violent extremists. These tend to be rule followers, right? And they tend to be concrete thinkers. They're quite literal thinkers. And so to be drawn into a system that has so many rules and so many structures and labels, it provides them with a framework for their ordering. So they may be drawn into this, which doesn't mean they're going to be radicalized to violent extremism. So the bottom line, and there are other disorders, by the way, before I wrap up, other disorders related to inceldom, personality disorders, especially narcissistic personality disorder, marked by grandiosity, entitlement, right? This starts to ring a bell with what we know about incels, especially those who act out violently. I think Elliot Rogers is a good example. Eating disorders, right? And body dysmorphic disorder. Oh my God, there's something wrong with my face. There's something wrong with my face. I need to get people who get multiple surgeries. So again, bottom line here is that mental health difficulties do loom large in this field around violent extremism, but the majority of the studies are not supporting this notion that violent extremism is related to mental illness. That was a nice try, right? Because when people got focused on terms like it's talking about otherization and say these people must be crazy to engage in this sort of behavior. No, it do not. We cannot justify attributing to mental illness, and the data supports that. Autism spectrum disorder is a small part of these mental health difficulties that relate to acts of violence and extremism, but autism spectrum disorder, to the extent that it's involved with inceldom, is not specifically related to violence.
Agreed.
Over to you. Okay, I guess we're done.
I just want to launch off in a few seconds just to set context and give you an understanding of where we are situated as an organization at Yorktown. So we're from Toronto, Canada, and Toronto, unfortunately, has not such a great history with incel violence. So two attacks, one a van attack that most people know about in this room on Yonge Street, which is one of our main streets in Toronto and downtown Toronto, I could believe killing 10 people. And then a few years later, another lone actor incel attack at a massage parlor, 17-year-old charged with terrorism. It was actually the first time in Canada the newly sort of categorized incel ideology being framed as terrorism. So that was the first charge. So not a great history in Toronto. We don't know why those two attacks were successful and if there's something different about Toronto than the rest of Canada, but nonetheless, we also, just to tell you a little bit about my program, because it kind of ties into what Ron's talking about. So we run a program called ETA, Estimated Time of Arrival, within Yorktown Family Services. And basically it's a systemic biopsychosocial approach to direct service intervention with individuals on the pathway towards violent extremism or involved in violent extremism ideology or groups. We work across the spectrum in terms of stages of radicalization. So people who are violently radicalized and potentially were planning or preparing an attack and has been intercepted by either national security services or local policing. And then pre-radicalization on the other end, where people may have some, and I love this word, stressors. I'm going to use it more. Sort of psychosocial stressors that may contribute later on down the road, falling into the extremist pathway. So where we intersect here, and where Ron and I agree, and what we've learned over the last 2 years, in particular with this population, is that you have to look at this problem as the individual as a holistic person. And it's not just about mental health, actually. Mental health is one piece of an intersection of psychosocial stressors. So some of the things, I have some of the data here from some of our incel clients. And just to kind of back up a little bit, about 6-7 months ago, we did a pilot with Moonshot, who we spoke a little earlier today around redirect. And so we collaborated with our CPN Prev friends in Quebec, and also with Moonshot to do ad placements on known incel YouTube channels and websites. And so what happened was people would log on to those sites, there'd be ads placed around, do you need a job? Do you want to talk to someone? Do you feel like your life isn't going well? And we actually had, during I believe it was 3-4 month period, 12 referrals come from those ad placements. Majority of them linked to the incel ideology. And so what we found was, when we interviewed the participants, is that domestic violence and intimate partner violence and their exposure to that as a child was about 95% prevalent with the clients and with the participants in our program. And I think that's really important here, because part of the incel ideology is violence towards women. And I think we have to talk about that a bit more. And that's not necessarily a mental health issue. That's a social issue, right? If you think about misogyny and patriotic society, and we still are kind of there. There's still violence against women as a baseline in our society, and continues to be in the Western world. So there's already a baseline. And if you're exposed to intimate partner violence as a child, you may not know how to respect women. You may think that this is normal. So that's one little thing. But then when you begin to add in sort of the other psychosocial factors, including most have been bullied quite extensively. Most have, I guess, engaged with adults that didn't necessarily treat them well. So there's evidence of sometimes sexual abuse, neglect in their lives. And this is pretty much solid with most of our clients when we meet with them. Haven't really had a positive relationship with a woman, but also, again, not really a positive relationship with a man. A lack of role models in their lives. I think many of them lack some of the social skills to build relationships in general, so that adds to the isolation. Touching on what Ron had said, most of our folks are very fixated in their thinking, very rigid. Self-esteem is next to nothing. Like they feel really bad about themselves. In fact, once they join the incel communities, it's almost like a competition to see who can feel the most bad about themselves, right? And you can see this on the online forums. It's quite tragic. Suicidal ideation, self-harm, and really they lack a lot of critical thinking skills. So that isn't really present with them, learning disabilities. So to Ron's point is that when all these factors come together, it creates this perfect storm. And again, they are looking, it's a human nature to want to have contact with people and relationships. So what happens is in sort of the offline world, they're unable to do that. They go online and find these communities where people have the similar stressors. And so relationships begin to build online. And then you have also hate groups that try to weaponize people that are vulnerable online. There's real intent behind that. We've seen topics on that over the last couple of days. So it's this perfect storm that begins to develop. But one of the things we're really interested at Yorktown is around the domestic violence exposure. I think it's something that we want to explore more. And how we work with these folks it's really about how do you build a relationship with somebody, because they simply just don't have those skills, or they've missed those opportunities in their life. That's been taken away by an adult usually. And to Ron's point again, I think trauma is evident here clearly. And so what happens when a bunch of people who are traumatized get together and there's no real positive outlet, they create trauma for other people in society. So I think definitely, if you leave here today, I think I would want you to take away the intersection of psychosocial factors that converge together. It's not just one thing.
Wonderful. Jill,
Thank
please.
you. Yeah, again, ditto. First of all, thank you, Jacob, for organizing this panel, and it's such a pleasure to be here with all of you. I'm really honored to be on this stage with everyone. I wanted to start just quickly with some background on the government perspective that I'm bringing to this chat. I work at something called the Canada Centre for Community Engagement and Prevention of Violence, and we're part of Public Safety Canada. Our mission is to bridge the gap between research and policy in the PCVE space, and tackling radicalization to violence online is one of our priorities. Our mandate comes from something called the National Strategy, and this is founded on the idea that radicalization to violence is a highly complex and very rare outcome that can result from a combination of factors that are specific to context, place, and time. And these factors will always differ depending on whether we're looking at an individual, a group, a social network, a milieu, or any other context. So any type of risk analysis always needs to consider the risks, needs, and vulnerabilities specific to that context, alongside any existing protective factors that could work to mitigate that risk. And all of this also needs to happen in addition to considering any potential harm or unintended consequences that could arise from the resulting PCVE work. So this is a complex job, not one that I envy, but it's tricky. And when we talk about any one factor as a potential contributor to radicalization, we do risk stigmatizing and securitizing larger demographics. In the case of mental illness, this is something that already has a very long history of stigmatization, neurodiversity as well. It's often misunderstood, and people, don't always have access to the services they need. They don't always receive the supports that they need. So assessing the role of mental illness or neurodiversity in the context of radicalization is extremely difficult. And this is compounded by difficulty in conducting any type of empirical research. There is difficulty accessing, populations to study. There's difficulty securing, control groups and making sure that you can get a large enough population. So starting off, we have a relatively shaky foundation of this topic, and even more gaps exist when it comes to incels, particularly because, they're a group that's relatively unstructured. They have a very flat structure as opposed to a hierarchical one, if anyone was in the Proud Boys chat yesterday. They congregate entirely online, and their users are anonymous, so it's really difficult to assess any mental health conditions or gather any type of reliable data from them. So this is a long introduction to say that given all of these complexities, it's really useful and important to approach this topic very cautiously, and with the framing that a risk factor like mental health should always be considered a correlational thing rather than a causational one. So using that as my frame, there are three sort of general assessments of this issue that I'd like to offer from a research and policy perspective. The first is that the topic of mental health as a risk factor is absolutely central to incels. Anecdotally, we see many users coming to incel forums in search of support, explanations, and coping mechanisms for all of the psychological distress they're feeling. Users, as you mentioned, Ron, report much higher than average levels of anxiety, depression, neurodiversity, suicidality, and other social issues, including bullying and exclusion. So based on what we hear and what we can gather from these communities, psychological distress can act as a vulnerability that may make some individuals susceptible to incel ideology. And once they enter that area, they may be susceptible to violent extremism. I do want to note quickly that I'm going to be grouping together mental illness and neurodiversity because that's how incels talk about them, but I just want to clarify, these are not the same thing. They shouldn't be conflated, but because incels do tend to group these things together, that's the reason for it. The second assessment I want to make is that those of us who work in the PCVE space can't take experiences of mental illness and neurodiversity in the incel community at face value. And what I mean by this is that Nearly all of the data we have on incels is gathered either sort of by watching what they say online, or it's done through surveys circulated by them within their communities. And partially due to the anonymity online and the fact that incels are generally resistant to mental health interventions, it's possible, if not likely, that many of these diagnoses are self-diagnosed, based on sort of users swapping stories and comparing notes and offering, labels for what each other is experiencing. This doesn't mean that the psychological distress they're experiencing is not legitimate. But what it does mean from a policy perspective and a research perspective is that in light of more reliable data, we need to consider the difference between the impact of a clinical diagnosis versus a self-diagnosis in incels and how that can potentially translate to something radical and violent. So in order to reckon with these differences, I think it's helpful to turn to individual versus group radicalization dynamics, which brings me to my last point, which is that when we zoom out from the individual to the wider incel ideology, the impact of mental illness and neurodiversity changes as risk factors. Across incel communities, what we see effectively is the coalescing of many individuals experiencing different degrees of psychological distress, forming into a larger culture. And this culture is one that exacerbates experiences of mental illness and neurodiversity. Some of the hallmarks, as both of you have already touched on, of incel culture include the encouragement of suicidality and self-harm, the glorification of mass violence, the active shaming of individuals that engage in any type of pro-social activity, including therapy or communities outside of the incel sphere. So the intragroup dynamics that reflect this are very strong. We can see an extensive lexicon and rituals and symbols that have all built up to reflect these values in incel communities and define the parameters of the in-group. One, very common example we can look to is the acronym LDAR, which stands for lay down and rot, which is something incels say to each other quite often, as well as, the catchphrase, it's over, this idea that there is nothing to look forward to in their lives. So ultimately, looking at the group level, this goes beyond any one individual experiencing psychological distress, mental illness, or neurodiversity, clinically diagnosed or not. When we look at the incel culture as an entity, we can see the creation of a violent ideology that manipulates these experiences into something that mobilizes its members towards violence. So just to wrap up, I think this is obviously a nuanced and complex conversation. In the case of incels, mental health is absolutely something that needs to be part of this conversation. But we do want to approach this topic in a way that recognizes its differential impacts based on context. And more research is needed, as always. At Public Safety, we are working towards this. I believe you referenced this. It was the Campbell collaboration paper that, yes, so Campbell collaboration, one of our partners released a paper that Ron was talking about. I would highly recommend reading it. It's very interesting. And lastly, we just want to be cautious not to let any distraction or any discussion of mental illness or neurodiversity distract us from the underlying violent extremist ideology here. And be careful in talking about this that identity factors like mental illness and neurodiversity don't get further stigmatized or securitized. So I'll stop there. Happy to answer any questions.
All right.
Please.
Well, thank you, Julia. Thank you, Jacob, Ron, David. Oftentimes I'm kind of writing because I learned as much. Pardeep, I'm with Parents for Peace. So I am a clinician by trade, but when we're working with Parents for Peace, a lot of times we are not developing treatment plans. We just can't, because some of these cases that we're getting are self-referrals or court referrals. And when they're coming in, we're also not diagnosing. So we're setting goals, and we're working with family members, or we're working with the subject of concern. But I may use some clinical language in some of this to kind of describe two cases, two subjects that I'm going to go over very quickly. First, I want to say that a lot of times when we think about identity, purpose, belonging, we think about the role of bullying, loneliness, how guys are kind of handling the world or not handling it. And one of the things that when we're working with a subject, one of the things that I'd like to look at is how is this person handling shame, and whatever shame kind of looks like to them. Is it something that are they okay with the rejection? Are they not okay with the rejection? Where are they on that rejection spectrum? And some of the most concerning ones are those that don't handle rejection well. Some of the best sort of programs are in schools that we've seen, and we've actually seen schools implement rejection programs. We've seen schools say, how can we separate this sense of rejection from you internalizing it to just saying you weren't the right person for this person, or you weren't the right person for this job, rather than you taking it so personal, right? And Brene Brown quote really kind of does this justice. Right? She says shame. What is it like? Some people view shame as like I did something wrong, so other people view shame as I am wrong. And I have 4 beautiful children, and I could tell you just from a biological standpoint, some of my kids who are born in the same house, under the same conditions, maybe the order of birth is different, but not a lot is different. But one kid's personality will just internalize shame much more than another kid's personality. So within all that, you have to kind of teach these skills. And I don't know if we're doing a good enough job of teaching some of those skills in schools. So with these 2 subjects, subject 1 became an eco-terrorist. He's a white male, freshman. He was wrongly accused of a sexual assault in high school. He found environmentalism, and that was part of his sort of identity-seeking behavior. How am I going to not have to deal with what I just dealt with, but how am I going to be bigger than myself, stronger than myself? So I take on this identity because I don't want to deal with the shame of all that just happened. The second subject, Nazism. Latino male. Freshman in college, both freshmen in college, rejected by his girlfriend and music. He was passionate about music. This was in high school. And that's when he heard this Adolf Hitler speech. And this Adolf Hitler speech made him feel, again, certain, bigger than self. And sometimes when we think about the political narrative that kind of exists in our country right now, and people are like, how are people believing in this person who has no credibility? It's because they sound certain. And they make an uncertain person feel certain. They might not know everything, but they say it with such confidence. And it makes sense to some of their internal grievances and maybe even biases. So, found Hitler, made him feel bigger than self, right? That was his identity-seeking behavior. The other part of this was, as we were working with both of these subjects, you can see, and I think Ron, you may have pointed this out, but they had absentee father figures. Most of the times when we're getting calls by mothers who are very attuned. And so the fathers are either kind of negligent, kind of condoning, or just simply not there. So they don't really have good male role models in that way. Both of these subjects did not have good male role models. Low levels of ASD. I think that's also important to point out, is that this is a small part of this whole, like everything that is happening, but there is somewhat of that's going on, either diagnosed or undiagnosed. So that's there. The other part is once both of these young men got into relationships, there's this overcompensation of shame put into female validated existence. which they're pouring into their girlfriends. That's a big part of their identity. They're overly attaching themselves. They're overly controlling. They're overly, and sometimes it doesn't mean that somebody is physically abusive, but when we're asking somebody where they're going to be, how long, like possessive, right? So, but both of them overly validated their own existence because of the relationships that they were in. Now, the good news with both of them, and one of the subjects, the difference is that, and I definitely, like, there's a lot of equivalencies that are provided. So I don't want to provide false equivalencies, especially when we think about the communal effect of one type of ideology and another type of ideology on our community. But we do, when we're understanding an individual, we want to see patterns. We want to see how they're navigating relationships. So when we start to see those things, we can work on improvement. And both subjects have improved. This is the course of about a year and a half, maybe a year with one subject. One of the subjects we've been able to directly kind of work with. The other subject we're working with the mom to work with that subject. And some of this is teaching parents how to really navigate some of this, how to get dad involved, how mom needs to make sure that she's not existing in somewhat of a codependent relationship, and reinforcing what that view is towards women as that young man goes forward. So there's a lot of that. The eco-terrorist now is doing better, has had a diagnosis of bipolar with schizophrenia, and again is in a better place. But there's a lot of the underlying factors that he's still not taking on, and the parents, especially the mom, is not taking on. And you can guess what that is. That's that past of being accused of sexual abuse that they're not going back to. And you know, they go so far as to walk around kind of the areas and the triggers that remind you of it. So with this work that we're trying to do, part of it is you got to take them through whatever is the shame. If we would like it or not, we got to go back there a little bit. And sometimes we use the motto of, like, if you can kind of touch your pain, you can grab your pain. If you can grab your pain, you can hold your pain. And if you can hold your pain, you may be able to manage and control it. So that's kind of what we're trying to do with both subjects. The other subject that we've been able to kind of directly work with is doing much better. The ideology, he's very, very reluctant to let it go, but he understands that it comes from wanting to be good enough for his dad. He didn't have that relationship, and he said basically, his father was Latino, and mom, so he viewed that as kind of that way of, like, Latino men don't take care of their children, and that's why I'm going to become a Nazi. But then going back and saying, you know what, I also wanted to impress my dad and be good enough for my dad and be big enough for my dad. And if I did this is the only way that I could get attention from my dad. Because when I talk to my dad about my Nazism, I can talk to him for an hour. But when I talk to my dad about myself, he doesn't even listen to me. So all of that is kind of there. And I think that as we're having this discussion, I may bring some of this back into these two cases, but I think teaching kids, teaching young men how to have a healthy sense of rejection is some of what we need to do as we go forward.
Thank you, wonderful insight. I have to say, I'm really happy that we can have this conversation. I'm really happy that Eradicate Hate has given us this platform. Because I've found, working on the incel issue from a counterterrorism angle, people are really reluctant to have the mental health, mental illness conversation here for a few reasons, and I'll list them. One is, okay, as Jill said, we're worried about stigmatizing neurodiversity. Fair enough. One is people think that you raise mental illness in the United States as a way to distract from the gun control question that doesn't exist elsewhere. Fair enough. The third being that people think you raise the mental health issue to distract from the fact that we're talking about legitimate political ideologies here that are deeply misogynist, deeply male supremacist. Fair enough. And there's actually one question here. We have some great questions that I think was along those lines, and I'll raise that here too. Can it be possible that some of these incels are using autism as an excuse or explanation for their behavior and characteristics? I mean, mostly these are self-identified. So my question is, with those three kind of challenges in mind as we have these conversations, how do we thread that needle? How do we make sure we can have this conversation in a productive way, act on the data that we have, make real impact where there's a real vulnerability here, without ignoring those legitimate questions that should be part of this conversation too? How do we make progress there? Any of you?
I just want to do a quick response to that, which is, the self-reporting issue, right? It makes it so difficult. Part of that may be the self-denigration that goes with inceldom. I'm awful. I'm defective. Mental cells, right, is a term that incels use. Like, oh, I must have a mental illness. I'm a mental cell, right? So to say, oh, I must be on the spectrum, I must be autistic, is a way, it's sort of a self-insult for some of these folks. Some of them may be quite legitimate, some of them with more insight, because it's not black and white, right? These people don't fall into categories, they're people. And it's a spectrum behavior in many ways. And so for them to say, some of them may be aware that they're having these difficulties and be struggling with the fact that they can't have social relationships, they can't connect, which is of course reinforcing, right, with the whole process. So
I think I agree, and it's a sense of, when you're on the online communities, it seems like a sense of bravado or street credit, right? So the more messed up I am, the more I'm going to get attention online. The more graphic I am, the more I move up in sort of points on a chart where, the more interactions I have, the engagements online, I am someone special. So I think they weaponize it on themselves, actually.
I'm going to follow up with you in a second on that, because there's another question here that I think really captures that well. Jill, did you want to jump in on that previous question?
Yeah, I mean, again, like you said, fair enough to all of those. It's really good to be cautious around this topic. That's a very complex issue, and we don't want to risk any negative effects that come out of this discussion. But I think it's possible to talk about mental illness as a risk factor alongside access to firearms as a risk factor. And we do need to take, I think at the government at least, we take a public health informed approach to prevention. And so we want to look at spaces far, far before where we get to a point where somebody might need intervention for violent extremism. Mental illness is something that should be treated everywhere, not only in the context of incels. And so when we look far down the line, we can start to have these conversations in the sense of, this is a public health model that we want to sort of bring into the conversation, not just because it could potentially lead to violent extremism, but because this is, a risk factor for, general well-being that we should be paying attention to. I think it's possible to have those nuanced conversations.
Yeah, Jacob, I just want to say one thing. I think we need to overhaul lots of the way that we look at services in society. Teachers, we need more teachers that are men, that are going to be part of these kids' lives. We need fathers to step up. We need to have those that are in direct services. We need men in those. And I'm not saying anything about women. That I'm not saying, but lots of these guys have perverse sort of mindsets about the role of women as nurturers in their life. And I want to be like, why can you not do the work on you? Why do you need somebody to complete you or help you or save you? So I think lovingly challenging some of these young men to kind of say, okay, you think, what is bravery? What is and then redefining all of that for them, because I think they do have a skewed view, but we also have kind of a skewed society. And when we're teaching masculinity and all these other things, we have lots of researchers, lots of psychiatrists who are in roles that men typically have. And I think looking at all of the dynamics in a communal society to say, what are we teaching them without us knowing that they're learning it?
Yeah, I'll just use that too to preview. The next panel is about broader male supremacy beyond incels, and we have Josh Roos here from Australia, who's an expert on healthy masculinity. So I think that'd be another good question to ask him. David, I'll follow up with you on one question here, on that point you made earlier. Is it accurate to say that within some incel communities, the sense of belonging overrides the desire to get help? And moreover, if a desire for belonging and a desire for identity are important factors here, how do we replace that? How do we replace what they're getting in the incel community? And I'll just follow up quickly too. There was a question on what Pardeep said earlier, the comparables between those two cases, but also how do we explain the fact that these people who are looking for an answer, looking for community belonging, why did they turn to extremism instead of all those ways that you can be productive, be part of a community, have an identity without it being an extremist movement? So anybody to jump in there?
I'll jump in quickly here. I think people seeking belonging and acceptance on incel forums is a direct result of people not getting what they need with the health system, at least in Canada. I think we saw an example earlier today where someone went, I think it was the Buffalo shooter, went to the ER, the emergency department, and they were turned away. We see this all the time in my program. You're a terrorist, you're on terrorism charges, sorry, we can't take you, go back to Yorktown. We don't have those inpatient resources. This is a major issue. So we have to be inclusive in our healthcare system, and not just inclusive to sort of, cultural competency, but also expanding that word culture into neurodiversity, into problems people bring to us that we don't understand, and we need to understand them. So we need to be more inclusive within the healthcare system, because they're going there because it's an outlet for them. In some ways, it does something for them in a positive way, even though we think that's skewed, but for them, it's actually helping them at some point. So.
I think that's great. I mean, and just makes me think of the work that Brett Steele is doing with McCain Institute and putting together networks of providers who will be comfortable with this. I did some work with the Boston office, the U.S. Attorney's Office on countering violent extremism, and my job was to go out and talk to community mental health folks, right? People who are running the community clinics, who are clinicians doing the work, right? And we're exactly that, like freaked out about, any extremist conversation, anything that's brought up, and getting them comfortable with the idea that looking at that as just one of the aspects of behavior, and maybe part of the messaging from this individual, maybe part of their individuation that they're trying to separate from their parents, rebelling against the parents who were never there, at the same time trying to impress the parents who are there, like framing extremism as a mental health issue. So to the extent, deliverable, here you go, I said the D word. In terms of deliverable, continuing to bridge that gap with clinicians, right, around specific topics like violence and mental illness, which a lot of people aren't comfortable with. The clinicians, at least in the States, think about this. It's either the person is eligible for temporary involuntary hospitalization, they have a major mental illness and a danger to themselves or others. Well, most of these people don't have a major mental illness that would qualify for hospitalization. They have personality disorders. They have psychological distress, right? They have mental vulnerabilities. They need treatment. But, in the U.S., our mental health system is busted, right? Most clinicians don't take insurance because the managed care companies pay so little of what the going rate would be, especially given the shortage of clinicians. So we don't have enough clinicians. I mean, it's a complete mess, but I'll stop ranting about that now. But so, we need to find a way to bridge that gap, and I think that would be a great deliverable to keep pressing in that direction.
Wonderful.
Yeah, just a question around why these two different people went to extremes. I think the one that got into Nazism was really trying, and sometimes people externalize what they feel internally, right? And I think there was a part of him who was trying to tell me that Adolf Hitler was misunderstood. And so that around our connection, and within this field, you do have to develop connection. You have to develop trust. So it's not that I'm condoning what he's saying. It's that I'm listening to what pain he's trying to express. And I'm trying to figure out what he's trying to say. And sometimes it's coming off wrong. And then I'm like, so the question was like, to him, do you feel misunderstood? Do you feel that way? Okay, well, tell me about that. And I think with the other one, so this was a little bit different between the two cases. The other one really wanted to be seen as a good guy, as doing something good. And he saw environmentalism as a complete good. And basically went into the super extreme because he wanted to vilify other people. So he would oftentimes go around and say, well, you know what, you're not hardcore enough. You're not putting yourself really out there. you're kind of sitting in your living room and you're sending money or you're supporting via tweets or whatever you're doing, that's kind of weak. Watch me put myself out there. And so he wanted to vilify other people. That was something that he was feeling. So he was essentially, both of them being deflective and not reflective enough.
Great. We have about 3 minutes left. I'm not going to get to all the questions, and I'm sorry. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and then we'll go down the line, and you can answer them, not answer them, or offer any closing remarks in the 3 minutes we have left. So one of those, I think, Ron, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this one. What are your thoughts on sentencing people with incel motives to mental health care instead of prison? Just for context, Alec Manassi and the Toronto van attacker, they attempted an insanity defense.
Yeah.
And I know you know that, Ron. Just give me 1 second. I'll just... The other one I think is interesting is, have you found many instances of incels without a male figure and therefore resenting or blaming their mother for their absence? So any thoughts on either of those two? And concluding remarks. David, why don't you go first?
Yes, big times number two, absolutely. We have to really explore more the relationship between the male role models and incel, but also intimate partner violence and violence against women. We have to really look at that more.
Insanity defense, recognizing that people are in such a state because of some medical or mental disability that they shouldn't be held responsible for their behavior. It would be wrong to hold them responsible. And so Canada uses the same standard, the McNaughton standard, that's used in most of the states now, in the federal government in the US, which says that because of a serious mental illness, the person lacked the ability to appreciate the nature and quality or the wrongfulness. So they didn't, that he didn't know he was driving a van down a sidewalk. He thought he was out, going cross country, or that it was an okay thing to do because of a mental disorder. And they tried to base that. Dr. Westphal from Yale was the main expert for the defense. They tried to base this on the lack of a theory of mind, that he couldn't appreciate that this was the wrong thing to do, and it failed, as most insanity defenses do.
Yeah, I think one thing that we haven't touched on yet, and is a whole panel in and of itself, is the idea of gender performance. And going back to the last question, I did just want to say, why incels are joining this community when they could go out and join, a football team or something. A lot of this has to do with, like you were talking about, how they perceive themselves and the impact of shame. And I think a lot of that comes back to gender performance and these expectations in their mind, how they see this sort of something that's already relatively boxed in but magnified and therefore unattainable for how they see themselves. The irony is that incels as a community began as a support group for people who were looking for help and peer support in romance and relationships, for people who didn't quite feel like they fit in. And so that is, again, like a discussion about digital culture and everything. But I think there's something there in the sense of it takes a community support to make sure that people feel taken care of.
10 seconds, party.
Strangely, a lot of this stuff can go back to a lot of people viewing themselves as, needing a support group. But I think just the depth of rejection sometimes felt is the depth of externalization sometimes longed for.
I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions. I know our panelists, some of them have to run off, so I will conclude, but they're all happy to meet later on, so please do come and find us. And please join me in a round of applause for our wonderful panel.